with my administrative announcements, and then we'll get started in about 10 minutes. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Delighted to have you all with us again for our second colonial discussion in a row. Certainly not unique to our Zoom interview series, but with our work on the Revolutionary War Guidebook, and that guidebook scheduled to come out here in September, we've got a fair number of Rev War programs, of which our speaker tonight, Gary Ecelbarger, is going to do several of them for us this year. And when you put him together with Scott Patchen, looking at George Washington and the French and Indian War, we're going to get a very robust look at early American leadership through the eyes of George Washington, things that affect him and so forth. So it's an exciting opportunity for us, and as we continue to build this inventory of Zoom interviews on our website, Karen, if you could pop that up for us. If you are new to us and are unfamiliar, you can see all of these at our Zoom web, at our YouTube website, and there you can sign up for free and join another 230 or 40 people that watch that for us. I think we're going to bring that up here just right now, and there you have it. Oh, look at that! We have surged in the last week or two. We were like at 225. We're now 317 subscribers. But if you look at that, we've got about 35 or 36 different interviews and so forth here, which would keep most of you just occupied and interested for some time. If you are not a subscriber, it's free, so I wouldn't hesitate to go ahead and sign up for that, and you can just keep yourself endlessly amused for 4 or 5 days. Then also, if you are a little more of a serious bend, these, of course, are kind of contemporary talks that are related to programs that we intend to do. If you're a little more seriously oriented, you can go take a look at our video archive series, which is free to active members of the Blue and Gray Education Society. Go ahead and click through that for just a second, Karen, and let them see that. That is on the home page. And then if you go scroll just a little bit on that, you'll also see a click box up there if you've never heard my talk about that. Matter of fact, go ahead and click into it for just a quick moment, Karen. There's a click box. That's me introducing the series, and it will tell you what you can expect there. And then go ahead, if you don't mind clicking into it for just a second, Karen, just show them what sort of inventory we have of talks. There's like 325 talks there that you can pick and choose from. They go back from 1994 through to about 2005. We've got about 75 more talks that will come up here in the next year or so. In fact, Karen, the lady who is scrolling through here for us, has been our contractor to get all this done, and she's done an outstanding job. So we've got some good things there. What am I looking for? I'm wondering, are you going in, or I'm not sure if she, I'm trying. Okay, I think she's going in now, but here you can see Ed Barrs giving a lecture, many lectures back in the 90s through 2000 and so forth, and oh, there we go. There, yeah. And you can just kind of scroll through here, and you can just see just endless numbers of different topics and so forth. So if you're not an active member of Blue and Gray, or if you are and you haven't signed up for this yet and you want to, it is it comes with your membership with Blue and Gray, and we encourage you to visit with that. The other thing I'd like to point out to you. Okay, I'm finished with that, Karen. Let's go ahead and go to your homepage. Karen Needles, who is our host for these Zoom talks and so forth, she has been putting together the Lincoln Digital Archives Digital Project for 25 years now, and I can't encourage you enough to go out and check it out. It's a free site. There are really neat things there. She has scanned 100,000 documents or more. Not all are posted up there, but there's enough on there to keep you really interested, whether they're lectures, whether they're series such as the trial transcripts for the Dakota Indian Wars, or the trial transcripts of the Lincoln trial. All those things are just endlessly fascinating, and on a rainy day, or any day for that matter, go on in, take a look. You can see the original documents, and some of them are actually transcribed as well, and you'll find a lot of enjoyment with that. What I do encourage is, if you have the opportunity, it's a free website. Karen has not had the time to incorporate this as a nonprofit, so donations are not tax deductible. However, the site is well worth supporting. It's been up for 15 or more years now, maybe 20 years, and the software she used to do this is outdated now. And what you may want to do, she's going to have to update the software, and it's about $15,000 if I understand that. So if you support what she does and support this kind of stuff, please go to the website, show her where they can make a donation, and I strongly encourage you to do that. So you showing them where they can make a donation? You just showing, okay. You can just go on in there and take a look, see, and there you go. So I hope you'll take the time. It's well worth the effort, and will be very good to support Karen. One or two other things real quick. For those of you who have not been on these with us before, this is a conversation between Gary and myself, and you all are muted now. The way we communicate on this is using the chat portion of Zoom. And what you need to know, and I would ask your cooperation to keep from disrupting it, is that Gary and I see when you guys talk on chat, it will briefly show up on our screens. I'm the moderator of this, and I really don't want Gary reading while he's answering another question. And I certainly don't want him being distracted by conversation between people who are in the meeting. So I would be grateful if you'd not do that, because it does appear on our screens. Natural inclination is to look at it and read at it. And, I might whisper on the back row if I'm in a lecture that Gary's given, but I try to keep it really low. Here, we can hear you. We can hear you when you type. So I ask you not to do that. We will, towards the tail end, you can type in a question anytime. You can also raise your hand. I will look at that, and depending on where I'm at in the discussion with Gary, I may fold your question in at that time, and I'll note it's your question. Or we'll get towards the tail end, and we'll tell everybody to unmute, and then you raise your hand, and Gary can answer questions that way. We'll finish at 8 o'clock or at 9 o'clock. with the last question being just before 9 o'clock, and then however long Gary takes to answer it, that will be the end of the conference. And if he wishes or is able to stay on for 5 or 10 minutes afterwards, and you have a question that you want to ask, I'm sure he'll be happy to answer that. But we will absolutely shut down no later than 9:15. So with that, Gary, delighted to have you with us again. Seems like just recently, but it has been a while, and it's good to talk to you again.
Yes, it's been a few years, Len. So actually, for these programs, I just was on last year for this as well. But I always like this format, and I think we should change it up for the questions, Len. I think let's do a reverse Jeopardy. Let's have them put their questions in the form of answers. Try that.
Okay. Well, listen, we've been interfacing and working together for the best part of 15 or 20 years now, and the one thing I always appreciated about you is that you always are intensely interested in many aspects of history, and you're always following your interests with strong research, and then also saying, well, how can I share this with people? And so you brought me a lot of different ideas and concepts over the years, and this interview tonight is the first of 3 tied to it over the next couple of years, and it was actually a concept that you brought to me 3-4 years ago, entitled Washington Between the Fours, and after some back and forth, you sold me that it was something we ought to do. And so I just wanted you to share with the group what's the general concept associated with Washington Between the Fours, and what inspired you to delve into this area?
Okay. Well, the concept, the Between the Fours, is between the July 4th, between Independence Days. And what I noticed while it's the concept of writing and touring in the form of a campaign biography. Sometimes people look at a subject throughout their military career, but this is kind of a fairly unique idea. I don't think it's been done that often, where you follow a person, usually a commanding general, through a campaign or through a series of campaigns, and look at that campaign through his eyes and his headquarters eyes, and take it from what did he know, when did he know it, and what did he do about it, and without losing sight of what's going on with the big picture of the campaign. So I toyed with that idea for a long time. I just didn't know where to place it with. I think I first thought about doing it with Blackjack Logan, because I had written his biography, and when the editor made me cut 40 pages out of my baby that I turned in, I had to cut most of the Civil War in-depth things with the idea, hey, maybe I'll do this as a campaign biography. But I dropped that idea. And then when I was doing your 5-year Atlanta series, I was toying with the idea of doing a book from Sherman's perspective. Although I didn't get a lot of, that's where I was really thinking about it at that time. I think anybody that was on the tour here heard me speaking out loud about what they thought about the concept. And I'll have to give Beegis more credit for this, because it really dawned on me when I ran a Brandywine-ish tour for you back in 2017. That's when it really hooked on me that I need to do this with Washington, because the correspondence within his headquarters and the personnel at his headquarters made it that much more enticing. I guess I wasn't too swayed by the musical, Hamilton the musical, but obviously that can't hurt. And so I milked that, and I said, where would I begin and end it? Because the Brandywine campaign or the Philadelphia campaign ends on somewhat of a cliffhanger or somewhat of a downer. So you need to tag Valley Forge in with that. And then you need to go take it to the next spring. So Between the Fours is what it ends up as. And to make a long story short, what people need to realize is that we're talking about the first anniversary of the celebration of the signing, or the initial signing of the Declaration of Independence, which actually was completely signed in August. the bill passed or the declaration actually passed on July 2nd, was ratified on July 4th. And that's when the first celebration of it occurred in 1777. So I found evidence throughout all 13 states, no longer counties, they're states, of all the great celebrations that were occurring with fireworks displays and feux de joie out of all the ships that were occurring in the harbors at Charleston and Philadelphia. And Washington's circled back to near his camp at Morristown, where he'd spent the winter. And there is no evidence on the 4th of July, 1777, that he even made any mention of this. No mention of American independence or any kind of celebration. Didn't give his men an extra gill of rum like he did back in 76. Nothing at all. Yet 1 year later, on July 4th, 1778, you had the first full-scale military parade at Washington's headquarters that he ordered, with all the pomp and circumstance, including green sprigs in the caps and firing along the line. Everybody commented on it. In fact, when Revolutionary War soldiers applied for their pensions 50 years later, some of them were talking about different battles they were in, but I found about a handful of accounts where people were talking about the 4th of July celebration in 1778 as if it was an equal event to fighting in a battle. So this was a big event to them. So my series is what happened between July 4th, 1777 and July 4th, 1778 that made that celebration something Washington wanted to do. It's a great story.
You know, it was interesting. I had a discussion with Scott last week talking about the French and Indian War and the young George Washington. And the thing that fascinates me, as a matter of fact, I am now in the 6th volume of the Douglas Southall Freeman biography on Washington that I've been reading for the last year or so. And in contemplating Washington and so many of the things that relate to him, this Washington's surrounded by a lot of controversy early in the war, and it continues on through that. And he's widely regarded as a guy who seemed to lose all the battles he fought in. Hey, most of them didn't turn out terribly well. He finds certainly in New York and so forth. And in this era that you start with, he starts out with defeat, and yet things change. Is the perception of Washington as a lucky loser? Is it a fair analysis? And if so, why? If not, why not?
In the context of where we're going to start this series, and now we'll focus mostly on really the June tour, which will be the first part. It's its own entity here. We should go into this without thinking that way at all about Washington. In fact, he's probably rivaling King George as the most famous name recognized figure on earth because of what occurred at the end of 76 and at the very beginning of 1777. So it's true he had a rough 1776 throughout the summer and fall, battling Sir William Howe, who, for those that see the image, William Howe's on the left and George Washington's on the right. And the revolution actually started right after the French and Indian War, but the Revolutionary War spawned from that, begins in 75, for the benefit of our Civil War members, just to kind of catch up to speed. We're really entering the third year of the Revolutionary War when we're looking at Washington in the summer of 1777. And he has been a formidable figure at this stage because of what he did the day after Christmas at Trenton, New Jersey, and then in what I always consider somewhat of a separate campaign with two battles at Assunpink Creek and at Princeton. And by the way, we're going to be touring that with this group appropriately in December of this year. Washington will have 3 straight victories he even had one victory in that awful New York campaign where William Howe just um, chewed up his army and spit it out and then chased it out of New York and through the Jerseys into Pennsylvania. And Washington's reclaimed that land. So by the time we look at him in the summer of 1777, and I'll expand on this in the first night of our program, Washington has had a successful spring as well against Sir William Howe's outposts, with mostly New Jersey militia fighting what we call the Forage War. And it's 56 engagements in an 84-day period, ending in the late spring of 1777, in which Washington essentially inflicts another 900 casualties upon the Crown forces. And even though these are very small engagements, maybe with a total of 15 casualties a day, you have 56 of those things with 10 bridge casualties or so, and that's what gets you up to your 900 losses in total. So it really was pretty devastating. And so Washington has been this continuous victor for the first several months of 1777. So when we go into that 1777 summer, where we're going to begin the first day of our tour, that's the way Washington's going to be looked at, which is actually kind of surprising that he doesn't take the time to, quote, let his hair down and celebrate the 4th of July. But he's always worried about what William Howe is going to do when he takes his army out of New York. Is he going to support another British movement coming out of Canada under Johnny Burgoyne? Is he going to try to attack Philadelphia, which has been a plan that he's been molding for quite a long time, or will he take a second attempt at Charleston, which the Crown forces failed to capture in South Carolina in 1776? So, in Washington's eyes, he has several options, and so Washington is pretty antsy in the Morristown areas and the watching range, trying to figure out what Howe is going to do.
It's what interests me a lot. As I said, I've read a fair number of Washington biographies and books and so forth related to him, and I've rank ordered Washington in my own mind in terms of the pantheon of leaders of our country and generals who have served in our country. But I apologize. That's a new cell phone I turned on, and that's just spam calls coming in that I haven't been able to shut down. So I'll try to turn that off when you answer the next question. But what I found with Washington was that that he's an intensely fascinating person. You've decided to tackle Washington as a result of many years of leading tours relating to him, and you've actually decided to tackle him and write a biography of him yourself. In what you've done so far, what was your going in position with Washington, and how, if any, has it changed as a result of the tours that you've led and the research that you've done for this book?
Well, since I'm investigating him more just in that 1 year period, I'm looking at him more as a military commander. So I don't have all the opportunity to lay him out as a figure separate from the war. Although there will be those moments at Valley Forge, for example, when his wife comes to spend the winter with him there. I'll get to describe that part of the campaign when he's not actively battling an opponent, but actually is working in a campground. But a lot of the depictions that we have of Washington that other biographers have laid out, and it's very understandable, having written biographies, cradle to grave biographies, as I call them. We tend to try to describe somebody and then use examples to fit that description that may cross into different years. And when they do that with Washington, I think it misrepresents him. I'll give you an example. There was a really nice biography that came out on him, a thinner book in early 2004, 2005, that made a claim that's kind of carried on throughout this century, that Washington decided to carry a Fabian strategy when battling Sir William Howe throughout the Philadelphia campaign. And although it's certainly true when you look at the correspondences of Washington, let's say in March of 1777, when he had a very small force of just a few thousand men, it obviously was the only option he had. He couldn't go toe to toe with the British Army. But one of the greatest discoveries I found is he quickly abandoned that concept, probably right during the Battle of Brandywine. There was no war of posts. The Fabian strategy is named after the Roman ruler who fought a war of posts, where you just get into brief engagements and then retreat to fight another day and maybe do some quick lightning strikes. I mean, you can almost call Trenton and Princeton a kind of a version of that. But Washington will stand toe to toe with Howe in a losing effort at Brandywine. And from that point on, the switch flips with him. That's a little anachronistic, I guess, for the 1770s. But he will decide that he is going to be on the attack, and he will have that attacking mindset from September through the Battle of Monmouth. So that's going to be the overriding theme of my book. That's one of the major changes that I found with Washington himself. And then it gets to the little, sometimes the little nuances that just are astounding to me. There's a description of Washington at his headquarters, and they always have one big meal in the middle of the afternoon, where he has his full staff together, and they're passing around lots of alcohol at these dinners. I'll actually bring the receipts to the tour and pass those around, and you'll see that there's a lot of grog and Madeira and other spirits being passed around. But one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence visits camp, and he's disgusted that of this very informal attitude. In fact, there always was this notion, especially in colonial times, that the chief, the big guy, sat at the head of the table. Washington's even giving up the head of the table in these dinners to one of his aides, and he didn't say who it was. My guess is it was probably Hamilton, and he sat two positions over, almost in a non-important position. So Washington has that. You'd think he'd be pretentious, given the fact that he's always referred to as His Excellency. But there's these moments that I see during the campaign that he routinely gives up that notion and is just one of the boys, so to speak.
That's interesting, because I do have a enduring perception of George Washington as being stickly formal, right, almost to the point of standoffish, and would you not dare to put your arm on his shoulder or hit your hand on his shoulder or something, but rather you would stand back deferential. But that's fascinating to see how he operates his mess, or would involve himself in his mess. Gary, we've done a lot of programs on the Civil War over the years, and you know, when you go do a Cedar Creek or for that matter, any of the Valley campaign, the 62 Valley campaign, the characteristics of these Civil War battles are a lot different. And for anybody who is contemplating or hasn't done Revolutionary War sites, what can you tell them is unique and special about discovering the glorious cause, as Washington would call it?
Well, for touring a Revolutionary War battlefields, if you're kind of on the fence and thinking about getting into a program, one of these kind of programs, do so, because you are in for a treat. I would say that much like some Civil War access, Revolutionary War battlefield access is improving over time. And I think because we're getting close to the 250th anniversary, so there's been a huge effort to have better interpretation of the fields. There's been archaeology on several sites related to the campaign I'm going to be touring us through. And it opens up a new interpretation and even a lot of great off the beaten path sites as well. There's several of Washington's headquarter sites that we can get to that are still intact. In fact, I've recently, well, for your group, I think it was probably the first organized group back 5 or 6 years ago, that I was able to get right at the actual landing site of the Great British Armada of 266 ships as they were embarking on their attempt to capture Philadelphia, with Washington attempting to block them. I can actually get them right at the site so they can overlook the waters of the Head of Elk and just picture all those ships sitting docked out there while trying to disembark from them. So those are the kind of things you'll see. In terms of the battles themselves, I think in Revolutionary War battles are a little different because unlike the Civil War, where they claim they use the bayonet in all these battles, in the Revolution they really do. At least on the British side, they're very skilled at using it. Washington's army is going to need good training during Valley Forge to get better at it. So you'll see the American troops improving on that between part one that we're doing this early this summer, and then part 3 that we do 2 years from now. But remember too that I think it's easier for me to present it, a little easier to interpret, and because you don't have the railroad and telegraph as to calculate into us. It's the old school way. It's a courier on a horse, like it was for several hundred years before then. So we can interpret battles about when a commander learns something and how long the message is going to get to somebody else, whether it's in the theater of the battle or the next state over. We need to understand that. And the battles themselves, if I was comparing the Battle of Brandywine, which we will be doing in this tour, or at least the setup of the Battle of the Clouds, it's not that it's not that the battles are necessarily smaller. In fact, for number of troops engaged, the battle, I just was trying to make sure I'm right about this. Yeah, the Battle of Brandywine is actually bigger than every single battle of the 1862 Shenandoah Valley campaign. Okay, so they're not, and you're dealing with a country that is, a fraction of its size in the 1770s as it was in the 1860s. So keep that in mind too. So these are, for their time, these are considered big, important events. And my point is to try to portray that as well when we get out on the field. But again, you're in for a treat when you go on these fields, because it's a whole new world of discovery for anybody that jumps onto a Revolutionary War program for the first time. You'll get hooked like I was back in the day.
The thing that fascinates me, this would probably be the third or the fourth time that I've done the Brandywine and the Clouds, Paoli, places like that, and I guess it's been 15 years or more ago that Steve Teff came out with a book on the Philadelphia campaign. The Philadelphia campaign and all the operations around Philadelphia, just intensely interesting to me, and I always find myself torn between the colonial capital, the happenings around Independence Hall and so forth, and then the military operations that take place in and around Philadelphia. And when you sold me on this, you had probably almost certainly spent much more time on the Brandywine and these others than I had, and you really got me excited about what you're doing. Since this is a 3-part series and we're going to take in the whole Philadelphia campaign and so forth, tell me, what is it that has really kind of hit you and said, aha, this is something people will really appreciate about this first part in Brandywine and the Battle of the Clouds and so forth?
Well, what's interesting, and it's also a it's also a moment of confession here, is that the Brandywine portion of this campaign that I'm going to present on in June is going to be quite different than what we presented, Scott Patchen and I, in 2017, 5 years ago, because of what we've learned since then. Part of that is just things I've discovered by some new information I've learned, and from digging into really kind of reading between the lines, so to speak, in the correspondences that were occurring. And the other is, since those times, a true good archaeology has been done throughout Chester County, bringing it back to the exact road network that existed in the Revolution period. And we found, for example, that the flank march that we'll talk about, for those that don't know about it, there's a big flank march in the Battle of Brandywine, in which over half the British army engages in to get on Washington's unsuspecting flank, is something that he had done to Washington previously in battles, but it's a different route than we've known before. And because of that, I've come to learn and appreciate, and it might be the subject of another journal article I'm going to write, that George Washington was essentially in a no-win situation, because it's when he knew there's only a certain time when the British Army, part of that flank march, is moving directly toward Washington, and then it's almost a 90-angle road that sends them up northward. So you would be fooled thinking that they were coming towards you, and then they're going to divert off to the flank, and that's 7 miles away from where Washington was standing. And so it's when he learns that information is when he can react to it. So I'm going to show that battle in a unique way. We're going to do it full scale, spending a whole day on that battle on both sides, so you get to appreciate exactly what's happening tactically. And then we're always going to take a little break from it and go back to the headquarters and drive to the headquarters site and say, here's what Washington knows. What should he have known? What did he do about it? And was it the appropriate decision? And we'll take it from there as well. So it's panning out, coming back, panning out, coming back, but it's got that headquarters aspect to it. Yeah, on this map, this shows the entire Philadelphia campaign for those that can see it. And for part one, and I don't know if Karen can draw the arrow from this, but if you go from, let's say from even Germantown, not the battle, but that's where Washington will have an encampment. Our part one focus in our 4 days will go from Germantown through Philadelphia. So go down to that little dot. Then we're going to go over to Chester and Wilmington and down all the way to the bottom left corner to Head of Elk. Going to go to that exact site, and then up to Chad's Ford. That's where the Battle of Brandywine is going to engage. And our part one will kind of go up to Whitehorse, and that's where we'll end that aspect of the Battle of the Clouds happened at Whitehorse Tavern. So that's the first part of our series, and it stands independently. But the point is that we're going to, by taking this from the headquarters aspect of it, we're going to learn quite a bit about, with new information and a new interpretation of that, about what Washington does and was it the right decision. And in some cases, you're going to find that he's probably going to be way too aggressive for what he actually has in terms of the quality of his troops. But you'll appreciate it, because it's going to be, even for those well-versed in the Revolution, you're going to hear a new story. And it's I'll call it revisionism for without an agenda. It's revisionism. It's because it's where the documents have led us. Okay, it's not agenda driven, but it's a new interpretation, and I'm laying my reputation on this, of course, very confidently, because it's accurate, and it's new, and it's very exciting.
Well, it's fascinating. Of course, Mike Harris wrote the book on the Battle of Brandywine, and you've known Mike for a bit now, and you all corroborate and so forth. I don't know the right way to ask this question, so I'll just try to ask it and try not to be awkward in asking it. What the hell's new? Mike's book is just recently out, and uh, what is it that you have found that Mike didn't find, and how is it that you happened to come across this that it precipitated this relook? Um, and is it? Let me caveat that by asking it this way. Um, is the perspective through Washington's eyes, this campaign biography in effect, has this actually steered you into entering the archives a different way than Mike did when he did Brandywine?
The answer to the second part is yes. The answer to the first part is I agree with much of um, uh, the tactics that Mike describes in Brandywine. By the way, Burt Dunkerley just did another Brandywine book focusing mostly on the Birmingham Heights battle part of it. Where I'm trying to have a new interpretation is that it's easy to say that Washington mishandled the intelligence and reacted too slowly, and without giving away the whole story. You're going to learn on site that that his whole goal is a little bit different than what others have perceived, and that based on when he receives the information and how he immediately reacts to it, that's where my interpretation is different. And Mike and I have gone back and forth on this a lot, and some things I finally persuaded him a little bit, because I sometimes get a little overzealous in this, and some things he and I are sticking to our differences, but there's really not that many in the tactical history of that battle. It's in how we're looking at Washington and how he's conducting the battle. In fact, what I'm going to tell you from the start is when he chooses to defend behind that river, what we'll call a river or creek, whatever you want to consider it, his army can only cover 5 miles of a system that can be flanked for several miles south of it all the way to Wilmington, or several miles north of it all the way on the Lancaster Road, which is around Route 30 today. So Washington didn't have an inevitable position that he could hold. He well understood, and I will show this through conversations that he had with General Greene while they were stationed in Delaware, that Washington's not really worried, at least seemingly anymore, that Howe's going to get around his flank and try to beat him to Philadelphia. Washington realizes that Howe, as Nathaniel Greene has explained to him, he's not after Philadelphia anymore. He's after you. And that's the other thing about this campaign and my tour, is you're going to have a whole new look at William Howe. This isn't the guy that purposely lets Washington get away, as it's been discussed in New York and in this campaign, when he could have chased him down and annihilated him. You're going to see a very aggressive William Howe, who is trying to end the revolution right here, right now. And the way you end the revolution is not necessarily capturing Philadelphia, but while Washington's in front of it, it's a twofer deal. In other words, if you annihilate the army, then you go to the capital. So what happens when George Washington moves away from the capital and from in front of William Howe, which happens in the immediate aftermath of Brandywine? Instead of Philadelphia being behind Washington, Washington moves north, and Howe now has an open invite to get into the city. And this information's been available for over 150 years, and I was shocked to realize that nobody saw this. It's in his engineer's diary. Howe learns that that he could use the same ford to get into Philadelphia that Washington used to go out of it. He knows exactly where Washington's army is, and he has his choice. He's going to go after Washington, and that's what the Battle of the Clouds is all about. That's the battle that I interpret completely and differently than it's ever been described before, because of that kind of information and from some new letters that I've discovered. So that's how we're going to end our tour on in June, and it's a whole new concept that I've put into articles in the Journal of the American Revolution, but it's the first time that you're going to see it on the touring grounds.
You know, I admire historians, and I admire the discipline that they apply to themselves to do research that leads to writing books and the other things that go into that. And having delved in it myself at the National Archives and elsewhere, I have to ask, because I've just never been there before, and I know the people on this particular conference call have an interest in the Rev War. Tell me something about the Revolutionary War Archives. Where do you really go, and where, it just seemed to me, forgive me for saying this, but, the United States fairly well established by 1860, and the papers and stuff. We have departments, all this other stuff. But these are papers that come from a period in which there is no organized United States and this other stuff. And you've got all these things. Where the hell did these papers go? And are they in good order, or is it just kind of willy-nilly out there?
Well, if you're gonna, this is where I'll have to separate from from a traditional campaign historian, as I was for the Atlanta campaign and the Shenandoah Valley campaign. The way Mike Harris, for example, would approach the Brandywine or the Philadelphia campaign, he's writing another book on it. So he and I are researching the same period, but we're doing completely different books. So we get together in the field and make some interesting discoveries while we're out there. The field work is extremely important because you have to see the lay of the land and try to figure it out that way. But in terms of the sources, it is much harder to write a book about a Revolutionary War battle than a Civil War battle. It's almost
I think so.
War, especially for 1862. In fact, I would tell you, writing about 1862 is a heck of a lot easier in the Shenandoah Valley. It's like shooting fish in a barrel compared to 1864. Revolutionary War is much tougher because there just is not enough soldier letters around, and there were no official reports. So you just had some personal correspondence of whatever soldiers you can garner their material from, and there's some out there. I think revolutionary historians, because of no other choice, tend to rely a lot now on pension applications. But the problem is those pension applications were 1830s, right? So late 1820s, 18. So you're talking about almost 50 years later. So unless, and sometimes you get really lucky where a soldier is applying for a pension and has like his old diary and will actually include information from the diary, which has never been revealed before. But that doesn't happen too often. So it's easier for me writing it from a headquarters perspective because of all the documentation that came out of headquarters. In fact, let me show you here. This is almost the equivalent of the OR, the Papers of George Washington, which have come out in different forms. There was a series that came out, I think it was Fitzgerald in the 1930s, and it's been updated now. University of Virginia is in the process of, they're not even complete yet, Cradle of Grave Writings of Washington that will exceed 60 volumes. There are about 9 or 10 volumes that I needed for my book, and it's off my shoulder where you have the on the top shelf there. That's these papers, and it's all the letters that George Washington wrote that are annotated and shows what he's responding to in any further correspondence. And I have to put it in an order on not when he's receiving a correspondence, it's in the order in the papers of date, but I have to do it not by the date it was written. I have to do it by the date it was received, because George Washington might be responding to it 3 or 4 days later. So the good news, I have that now because of the the talent and skill of his of his headquarters staff, we have their writings as well. A lot of them are published. And so even during COVID, it was a great benefit to have access to those. In terms of good archive sources, I still have to get out because they've been closed for a while. But the Clement Library in Michigan is a very important site for me to visit because Clinton's papers, the British General Clinton, has information there that I'm going to need to get. But from my perspective, I don't have to reinvent the actual tactics of the battlefield. I have to look at it from the headquarters perspective. I have, just by happenstance, been able to reinterpret a few things because I've been fond of reading through newspapers ever since they were on microfilm. And since the internet, where you now have so many more digitized papers, there are a lot more papers during the Revolution than most people would realize. And there are more of excerpts of soldiers' letters that get published in those papers that once in a while you have a nice little neat find. I'll give you an example. And we're going to do this in my tour. There was a reconnaissance that Washington conducted when he was in Delaware. And in our tour in June, we're actually going to be in 4 different states, okay, without traveling all that far. New Jersey, Pennsylvania, a brief touch into Maryland, and Delaware. But Washington's reconnaissance had always been depicted as just him, the Marquis de Lafayette, and Nathaniel Greene, just 3 people and maybe a couple of aides that were with them. But I found a letter that and a receipt written by none other than Alexander Hamilton, who obviously was on this reconnaissance as well. So that's kind of a nice little hitch to it. Who writes out a receipt that there were 18 breakfasts being served at this tavern. So we know that there were a lot more than that. In the letter I found, they said that all of his generals accompanied him on his tour. So doesn't that lead to an interesting question? Why would you bring all your generals out for a reconnaissance? What's that all about? And that just opens a whole new world of interpretation. So a lot of what I'm going to write, what I write about and tour about, some of it has to be speculative. And we find that more in the Revolutionary War than we do, although we still have it in the Civil War, but there's still open-ended questions. And I'm very clear on this when I give tours. I will tell you what is fact that has solid evidence behind it, and what is more speculative, and what foundation of evidence I'm using to come up with that speculation. But again, I got to tell you, for those that are, even those that are well-versed in the Revolution, this is new and exciting stuff because of some of these new findings here.
Great. Washington and Howe in this program are the A-listers. They're top of the scheme. But as I've said, I really like the Philadelphia campaign, and there's so many neat people involved in that. Who are the underlings that we're gonna get to know much better when we're out with you? Who and why do we get to know them better?
Okay, well, on the British side, we're going to talk about people like Lord Charles Cornwallis. I'm going to leave that off for tonight. We'll talk a little bit about some of the Americans. Again, mostly associated with Washington's headquarters. Washington's headquarters is, when I say Washington's headquarters, it's hard to get that concept. I mean, we're going to go to a few sites, and Karen, there might be a Council War picture, if you have one you could put up, where the actual site is still existing today. And Washington held several councils with his subordinates. And these are big affairs where you had a lot of the key generals that were with him at the time. So there's some of the same people that we've discussed in this previous format. People like Nathaniel Greene, who I've already brought up, John Sullivan. These are his division commanders. Washington has reformed his army, where the chief fighting unit of the British Army is the regiment. For Washington, it's going to be the brigade, and his army is going to be that's with him, he sent a lot of his troops to help Horatio Gates in the north. But the army that's with him generally is 10 brigades that are organized into 5 divisions. And then there are a couple of independent brigades as well. So that's the infantry. And the infantry commanders we're going to learn about, which is Greene and Sullivan, Lord Sterling a little bit, General Stephen, who has an interesting relationship with George Washington, and even Anthony Wayne. We'll talk a little bit about Mad Anthony Wayne. And we're going to actually visit that general's gravesite. But with Washington's headquarters, it's a collection of up to 30 people at times, which includes a household staff. We'll talk a little bit about his the household staff that moves with him. There's a collection of aides that Washington finagles to have more people that become his penmen. And when I say penmen, they write his letters, but I consider it like a presidential speechwriter. The president would lay out the theme of what he wants written in the several speeches that he has to give on any given day. The speechwriters will write the speech, and then the president will go over them and edit them and add a few lines. Well, that's exactly what Washington did with all these correspondences, is they come under his name, his signature, and they have his. If you look at the originals, they have a little bit of his editing in it. These penmen, including Alexander Hamilton, John Lawrence, those are the 2 stars of the musical, right? They're involved with this. But there's other less unsung heroes that I would consider. People like Tench Tillman, who was a volunteer. He did this without pay until 1780. Caleb Gibbs, who is doing triple duty. He's the head of Washington's Life Guard. He ends up being the steward of his household staff. And he also is a volunteer penman for George Washington as well. These people have learned how to channel George Washington's thoughts very well into these very not overly verbose correspondences, but they're sweet and to the point. You could see Washington's anger come out in those at times. You could see Washington's attempts at propaganda in his general orders of the day. All this comes through at headquarters. And it's just a fascinating thing that I had been on a learning curve for a little while before I started writing about it. But I have a much better appreciation of it than I ever have before. And I'm looking forward to parlaying that off to the group when we get to the site. So when we go to headquarters, you see a building. And I'm convinced that in many places, especially during the non-winter months, that the building was rarely used, except for maybe a general meeting for councils. But in general, you had a little tent city around headquarters where you had all the staff tents, and Washington had 3 pretty big marquees, big linen tents that were set up for himself. And that's how a headquarters site actually looked. The other thing is you had a couple other generals to expand on this a little more. I've already brought up Lafayette. Lafayette's a teenager. He's 19 years old when he's joined up with Washington. And we're going to go to the exact spot where those 2 meet for the first time. So remember, today there are 70, I think there's around 70 towns and counties, et cetera, that have a portion of Lafayette's name attached to it. So you'll see where that originally comes from when we meet Lafayette for the first time. And you'll also be surprised to learn that despite the traditional interpretation that Washington treated him like a son, Washington was not happy with Lafayette at all in the first part of this campaign. And I'll explain why when we're in the field. So we'll learn about him as well, and some other characters like Casimir Pulaski, his Polish head of cavalry. We'll learn about his entry into this as well.
Cool. Since the last time we went, gotta ask, what is it you're going to show me that I haven't seen before on this first part?
Well, for sites, we're going to go to a couple of headquarters spots that I've only recently been able to find. So we'll be able to get a small group out there, and a real special treat. It showed up on the map that Karen had put up earlier. The Battle of the Clouds sometimes is called the Battle of Whitehorse, and Whitehorse Tavern is the reason it's named for that. So to give you one specific answer, what you're talking about, we're going to get a special once in a lifetime group entry into the actual Whitehorse Tavern, which is you'd only been able to see it from a distance from before. And Len, I'm going to credit Beegis for this because when I gave a tour in 2018 at Monmouth, one of the people on the tour happens to own Whitehorse Tavern, and I contacted him, and hopefully he'll come on this one with us, but he's definitely going to open the property for us, and we'll see Whitehorse. Whitehorse is where Road Network spoked off of. It was a very well-known site, and as Bill Loftus has told me as well, he now found that Thomas Jefferson, just 2 months after he wrote the Declaration, spent the night in Whitehorse Tavern as well. So it's going to be quite a treat to go there.
Well, I remember us looking at it from afar the last time.
From a business park.
The Loftuses own that?
Bill does, yeah.
I'll be damned. Okay, well, he's now, I don't know if he's on here or not, but Bill, if you are, you're mine, buddy. We're gonna have a talk. But that's cool. I like that.
Len, I overstepped probably, but I promised him a little discount if he comes aboard.
Yeah, okay, but I'll get his membership dues. Hey, I got one more question for you, and we're just about to run out of time. Which time does fly when you're having fun.
Yeah.
But this has been a good conversation. Tell me, just so that people can have a perspective, because this is a 3-part series. We're gonna do it over 3 years' time, and people, their time and their money is special to them, and this is the first one. This is the foot in the door that is gonna help them decide whether to go on to the next 3. Can you just can you walk us through where 1 goes, where 2 goes, and where 3 goes, and how is this series going to play out?
Okay. The most important part to bring up about this is that it's part of a series, but they're independent tours. In other words, you don't have to take part in all 3, and you don't. I hope you come on the first one, but if you're more interested in the second, it'll stand alone, because they all have their own separate story arcs. I already told you about the grand story arc between July 4th, 1777 and July 4th, 1778. And that's what the 3-part series is going to cover. But each of these are independent and not dependent on you having gone to the previous one to understand it. And for example, we're going to do the Trenton Princeton tour in December, which is after we do part 1, but that in the chronology of what occurred during the Revolution, what we cover in December occurred before part 1. So that's just proof that you can do these things independently and still understand what's going on, as long as I correctly provide the context. So part 1, I'm going to give an evening presentation. Rich Rosenthal, who is on tonight, and I were going to work out to try to get folks out to Morristown, but it's just too much travel. So what I'll do is talk about the Morristown July 4th aspect of it in our evening presentation. Our part 1 will start at the Delaware with another crossing in the opposite direction. So Washington will cross the Delaware again, but we'll start at a Washington headquarters that doesn't get a lot of attention near that crossing of the Delaware at Corriel's Ferry. Then we'll go to the actual crossing site itself, and we'll follow Washington to Philadelphia. This is our first day. We're going to, part of our day, we'll do what is necessary. If you're in downtown Philadelphia, you have to go to the Museum of the Revolution. So our group will do that because we did that in 2017. Everybody enjoyed it. The displays have been updated a little bit, so people that were on it then should go again. And then we're gonna, the first day is going to be looking at some new headquarters areas where Washington's army camped to understand why he's starting to move away from Philadelphia. This yin and yang approach to understand how Howe is turning Washington inside out with determining where he was going to go. Was he going to go up to Delaware? Was he going to go to Charleston, what they called Charlestown for South Carolina?
Yeah.
Or was he going to go? Was he going to go threaten Boston, or was he going to go try to get up Long Island Sound and help Johnny Burgoyne? So we'll talk all about why Washington's headquarters are moving out and bring in these key players that we're going to see over the next few days. That'll be the first day. Our second day is primarily Delaware, with a little bit of Maryland, and look at the great Army encampment there. With the help of Mike Harris, we have found what used to be a guessing game on Washington's numbers. We now have a September 4th, 1777 return that we just published the results of. I'll bring that information out. But to give you a heads up, George Washington outnumbered William Howe.
Really?
Yeah, he did. And we have the proof of that. Not in the quality of the troops, but in the quantity. So we'll talk about what that means in terms of what kind of war strategy you're going to conduct. So that's something we're going to talk about in day 2, and we'll talk about that new information I brought up about the Washington's head of elk reconnaissance. We're going to see a lot of places where Washington had his headquarters. Some the site's still there, some the actual building is still there. We're going to go to the landing site as well, and then we're going to follow. By the way, this what Karen has up here is Washington's lifeguard, which is another aspect of his headquarters, and probably one of the officers riding in the front is Caleb Gibbs, who is one of Washington's penmen as well. These are blue and buff uniformed and uniform height, I should say, around 5'9". Washington tried to have them all about the same height, and they would pick out the headquarters sites and would occupy that with anywhere up to 100 men. So that has to be taken into account as well. They weren't really part of battles until generally you'll see them involved in one in 1778. But that's part of our day 2. And the new treat on day 2 is because of the archaeology work that's been done. We're going to follow Washington's exact route from the Red Clay Creek defense to the Brandywine defense, and why he chose that and how long in advance he had planned for that one, how tried to outflank him. And that's how we'll end our second day. The third day, as I already said, is going to be a new revised look from the headquarters perspective and just the general battle of the Battle of Brandywine. And by the way, as a personal insight, I'm almost kicking myself. I've been running Brandywine tours since 2005. I think I visited that field for the first time in 1991. And I only discovered 6 months ago that 300 acres of that field is my great to the 7th grandfather's property. So you'll have to indulge me. We'll divert to his 1743 house that's on the battlefield as well. But so I have a couple of ancestors that had property right where the Battle of Brandywine was fought. So we're gonna go through that field as well. And talk about what Washington knew, what he didn't know, how he fought well, how he didn't fight well, and look at the responsibilities. And we're also going to, at his headquarters, which still stands on another ancestor's property, of my ancestor's property, William Howe. And I'm going to give you a whole new interpretation of William Howe that you've never had before for those that know him, and obviously for the first time that those that didn't. And I'll give you the evidence for that too. And then our last day, we did some of this in 2017, but we're going to follow the same route. We're going to start that day looking at Levering's Ford, where Washington recrossed. He first goes into Philadelphia and then recrosses the Schuylkill at Levering's Ford. And I'll tell you the importance of Levering's Ford that I didn't know in 2017, which is that William Howe knew about its existence and disregarded it to go after Washington. And then we'll follow Washington on the Lancaster Road to White Horse Tavern, where we'll get our special treat there in terms of getting to look at that site. And then I'll give you a whole new interpretation of the Battle of the Clouds based on the information that I found. And my plan and this is a new ending in Len, and it has a lot to do where you chose the headquarters. I know you didn't choose it this way. We're going to go to Yellow Springs Tavern, where Washington went after the Battle of the Clouds. We're going to see another Washington headquarters site. I'm going to tell you why he went there. We're going to end our day not just there, but as a little prelude to what you're going to see in the next series of tours. You're going to see the actual foundation at Yellow Springs Tavern of the main hospital where all the sick soldiers from Valley Forge were taken to. When we talk about the 2,000 dead that occurred at Valley Forge in the 6-month encampment, they didn't die in Valley Forge. Washington made sure that that wasn't occurring in front of his soldiers' eyes. They were removed to these series of hospitals, and this was probably the biggest one. And we're going to sit within the exact foundation of that hospital. So we'll get a little ahead of the game because it's geographically convenient. We're going to end the day going back to the hotel with a skirmish at Valley Forge with some key revolutionaries. One will be Alexander Hamilton on one of his first independent missions, accompanied by the father of Robert E. Lee, Light Horse Harry Lee. So we'll talk about them on September 18th and what they did or didn't do at Valley Forge and how it's going to set the scene for part 2. But as it sits as for part 1, it's a nice separate independent program that you can decide to carry on to the next year, or skip the next year and go to the 3rd year, which is Valley Forge and Monmouth, or choose to do all 3. But it works either way, and it works for those that are well versed in the Revolution, and for those, please come aboard if you're interested. You won't be disappointed. For those that want to join in on one of their first Revolutionary War programs, like I said, you're in for a treat. The land speaks for itself.
Gary, as always, time flies when we're chatting, and I enjoy every bit of it. I could listen to you talk endlessly, but I'm fairly disciplined with wrapping these things up, and we've reached the end of our time. There were a few complimentary comments. 1 or 2 people had to drop off towards the tail end for other appointments and stuff, but the folks all hung in there for this, and I think they enjoyed it a great deal. And so I want to thank you for it. We'll look forward. Yeah. The program is up on our website now. It's open for registration. We'd love to see you if you got some time on your hands in June. So thanks so very much for coming. Karen, thank you. Gary, thank you. If anybody has any questions, we'll hang in here for, if you're okay with that, Gary, no more than 5 minutes or so.
Yeah, please.
Afterwards.
Please do so. Thank you.